Chapter 20, Section 4. The Bolsheviks Take Control. The reforms and crackdowns that followed the revolution of 1905 slowed peasant disturbances, strikes, and other protests. For a time, a degree of calm returned to the empire. However, the complaints of the industrial working class had not been addressed, and tensions remained high. After 1912, violent strikes took place with increasing frequency across the empire. Many of them were efforts to improve workers' conditions. Strikers expressed the view that their goals could only be achieved with the overthrow of the monarchy. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 greatly influenced the coming of the Revolution of 1917, as well as the course the revolution took, its outcome, and the government that emerged. Russia was poorly prepared for the war, and it put an enormous strain on Russian society. Nearly 15 million men were called to military service. Of these 15 million, nearly 6 million had been killed, wounded, or captured by 1917. Most Russians supported the war at first, and the violent strikes initially subsided. Patriotic fervor soon faded, however, as the Russian army suffered defeats and economic hardships developed at home. By 1915, war protests appeared in every social class. The protests increased in 1916 as the call-up of millions of peasants into the army reduced the food supply. The high costs of fighting the war caused prices to rise while workers' wages remained low. By late 1916, conditions on the home front had become grim. Worker and peasant opposition to the war and the government grew even stronger. Most upper and middle class Russians continued to support the war itself, but they became increasingly critical of the government. The February Revolution. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was actually two revolutions. The first, called the February Revolution, toppled a 400-year-old monarchy and established a democracy. The second, called the October Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, brought even more drastic change to Russia. The February Revolution began in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, on February 23, 1917, when women factory workers, angered over the food shortages, protested having to stand in line for bread. They called on men at nearby factories to join them. Within days, nearly all workers in Petrograd were on strike. They were joined by students and members of the city's middle class. Troops called out to end the demonstrations refused to do so. Instead, many soldiers actually joined the protests. Meanwhile, the uprising spread to cities and army units across the empire. Nicholas, who was away at World War I's Eastern Front, responded to the crisis by dissolving the Duma. However, it refused to disband. Instead, it formed a temporary government called the Provisional Government to rule Russia until a democratic assembly could be elected to create a new, permanent system of government. Russia's top military commanders decided to support the Provisional Government in the hope that it could end the unrest that was hurting Russia's war effort. Having lost control of his army, his government, and his people, Nicholas gave up the throne. Dual power. The Provisional Government tried to rule for the entire nation, but most of its members were from the middle class. Working-class Russians instead placed their loyalty in the Petrograd Soviet and in similar councils, called Soviets, that quickly sprang up in other cities. In the summer of 1917, the leaders of these local Soviets united to form the All-Russian Soviet in Petrograd. The All-Russian Soviet and the local Soviets became a sort of second government for Russia. When they disagreed with the Provisional Government, they passed laws and issued orders of their own. This system of dual power contributed to the chaos that developed as peasants seized land, soldiers deserted, and ethnic minorities demanded self-rule. The October Revolution. In April, Bolshevik leader Lenin returned to Russia after 10 years in exile. He immediately called for the Soviets to overthrow the Provisional Government. However, the Mensheviks and other less radical revolutionaries controlled most Soviets. The Bolsheviks were in the minority. When Bolshevik workers and soldiers took to the streets of Petrograd in July of 1917, the Petrograd Soviet refused to support them. Government troops easily ended the uprising. Events soon turned in the Bolsheviks' favor. By mid-August, the government's war offensive was going badly and shortages of food and other goods had become severe. An increasing number of Russians supported transferring all government to the Soviets. All power to the Soviets became their cry. This caused Russia's more conservative elements, like the Cadets, to call for extreme measures. The government sent troops to seize the Petrograd Soviet. The attack collapsed, however, when Soviet members told the soldiers that they were being used to put the upper classes back in control. In September, the Bolsheviks began gaining majorities in some Soviets, including the Petrograd Soviet, the country's most important. They decided that the time was right to seize power. Lenin decided to overthrow the provisional government when the All-Russia Congress of Soviets met in Petrograd on October 25th. This plan made the revolt look like a takeover by all the Soviets instead of the act of a single political party. During the night of October 24th, Bolshevik soldiers quietly took control of bridges, telegraph offices, railroad stations, and other key points in the city. The next morning, Lenin announced that the government had been overthrown and that the Congress of Soviets had taken power. By the end of the day, the provisional government had surrendered. On October 26, 1917, the Congress of Soviets voted to approve the Bolsheviks' actions and formed a leadership council to head the new government. It put Lenin in charge and named Bolsheviks to other key posts. At Lenin's request, the Congress passed decrees giving all private land to the peasants and giving workers control of their factories. A second revolution had taken place with hardly a shot being fired, and Lenin had turned the people's demand for all power to the Soviets into a Bolshevik government. Civil War. The Bolsheviks moved quickly to solidify their power. They reaffirmed censorship of the press, created a new secret police force to deal with those who opposed them, and ended Russia's participation in the Great War. They also had to deal with the democratic elections that the people had been promised after the February Revolution. The Bolsheviks controlled only Petrograd, Moscow, and some other industrial regions, so Lenin only reluctantly agreed to let the elections take place. Less than 25% of the delegates elected to the newest National Assembly were Bolsheviks. Rather than share power with other parties, Lenin forced the assembly to disband. This plunged Russia into a complicated 3-year civil war. The Bolsheviks formed an army, called the Red Army, in February of 1918. In Europe, the color red historically symbolized socialist revolution. In March, they changed the name of their party to the Communist Party. The Communists, or Reds, were opposed by anti-communist forces called the Whites. The Whites included Russians who wanted to restore the monarchy, supporters of the provisional government and capitalist democracy, and some Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. Peasant forces called the Greens fought to keep their lands free of both red and white control. The Whites were aided by the Allies, mainly the United States, Britain, and France, who provided troops and supplies. The Allies did this in part because they did not want Russia to pull out of World War I, but they also did this because they feared that the communists would spread their revolution if they were not defeated. Indeed, Lenin formed an organization called the Comintern in 1919 to organize and aid communist parties in other nations. However, the White armies were hopelessly divided by both geography and the causes for which they were fighting. These factors weakened the Whites and helped lead to their defeat. The Red Army also had to deal with nationalist movements in non-Russian parts of the former empire. Rather than granting these regions complete independence, the communists established 6 self-governing Soviet republics. By 1922, they had defeated the Whites and the Greens and joined these republics with Russia to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union and USSR for short. War, Communism, and the Red Terror. The Civil War caused Lenin to introduce an economic policy called war communism. The government took over all private businesses and industries and dictated what was to be produced. Workers, who understood communism to mean that they would control the means of production, resisted with frequent strikes. In the countryside, the peasants were forced to provide grain and other produce so that Russia's cities and the army could be fed. Armed bands of party members and Red Army troops were sent to villages to collect this food. Groups of unhappy peasants rose in revolt. Faced with such unrest as well as civil war, the communists used extreme measures to stay in power. They called these measures the Red Terror. Lenin ordered the secret police to arrest any person suspected of being an enemy of the revolution. Potential enemies included nobles, religious leaders, merchants, former government officials, non-communist revolutionaries, and other members of the educated middle class. Striking workers and peasants who resisted war or communism also faced harsh punishments. The police were permitted to execute anyone they arrested. It is estimated that as many as 300,000 people met this fate. They included the Tsar and his entire family, whom Lenin ordered to be killed in July of 1918. Thousands of other enemies were held in prisons or other harsh conditions in prison camps, where many more died. Lenin was motivated by his firm belief that the only way to that the revolution would survive was if the Bolsheviks retained control. New policies and new leadership. In 1921, Lenin replaced war communism with the New Economic Policy, or NEP. The Civil War had ended in victory for the Reds, but the peasant revolts continued. Lenin realized that the Bolshevik Revolution could not survive if the countryside opposed it. The NEP relaxed the extreme policies of war communism. Taxes replaced the requirement that peasants provide the government with food. Farm products could now be freely bought, sold, and traded. Communications, transportation, and major industries such as mining, oil, and steel remained under government control. However, other businesses could be privately owned and operated for profit. As Lenin was reshaping Soviet communism, his health was beginning to fail. His death in 1924 set off a power struggle in the Communist Party. Over the next 4 years, Party Secretary Joseph Stalin outmaneuvered and eventually ousted his rivals. By 1928, he was securely in power.